technology is amazing. If we did this 40 years ago, we'd be halfway through it. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for actually coming here tonight. My name is Maurice Hetherington. I am the CEC Senate candidate for the next coming federal election for Queensland, and the party's former national chairman of 10 years. I will be chairing the meeting tonight, and I'm sure with your intelligence and my patience, we'll have a good time. We'd like you to question time to be after the two speakers, please, and come to the mic down here so that we can get, a recording of what your concerns are. The bookshop outside, which you're familiar with, which is something that's important to us, that we actually spread ideas and opportunities to the people. You are here because you recognise the crisis we face in the terms of water. Tonight you will witness one of the two possible responses to that crisis. One of these responses happened in Canberra yesterday at the Council of Australian Government's meeting between the Prime Minister and the State Premiers. You'll be probably familiar with that on the news. The meeting committed Australia to giving into the radical greenie agenda by agreeing to a financial arrangements to redistribute the water currently available. And bear on this mind, the currently available. In essence, those arrangements amounted to deal with farmers, giving the farmers paper currency in exchange for their rights for the use of real water to produce real food, which everybody, even the greenies, rely on to survive. That water, which the farmers give up, will be flushed down the rivers and out into the ocean. This is called environmentalism, or sustainability. These are new words to old fellas like me. They don't make a lot of sense. What's happened, what wasn't discussed in Canberra was the ideas to generate more water, and that's our capability. Not because it isn't possible, but because it is sacrilegious to the prevailing greenie agenda, which is now conquering Canberra and nations around the world. Never mind the fact that we can generate more water will solve the water crisis in a way that will benefit everybody. They won't discuss it in Canberra, but that's exactly what we intend to discuss tonight. And I just want to share a little thing with you for a moment here. On Thursday night in Rockhampton, my daughter gave birth to my 10th grandchild. And now this little guy was 1 hour old at midnight Thursday night when old Grandad came in to check him out, count his fingers and toes. And I put down his hand and he grabbed my finger, little fella, and I was thinking to myself, now righto, 1 hour, 64 years of age, I haven't counted the hours, what is he coming into? What are we leading this generation into? Now the difference between my thinking, which is Plato or Platonic thinking, is that little man is the most precious thing that's happened to our family in the last little while. But if I was a greenie, a hardcore greenie, my first thoughts would be, another mouth to feed, he's going to destroy Mother Earth and all the nonsense. Now this is where I think this thing's gone too far, and it's up to us to start looking at the reality. Where do the human beings fit into the system, and forget about the green frogs for a while. So tonight we have the pleasure of being addressed by Professor Lance Endersbee. Professor Endersbee is a civil engineer and began his career working in the Snowy Mountains hydroelectric scheme, which is probably the greatest project we have done as a nation in the last decade. I don't think anything supersedes it. And I married a beautiful girl in 1960, and usually I suppose you used to take from where I live in central Queensland, Baralaba, you'd go to Hamilton Island or Green Island for your honeymoon. I talked this lass into going to the Snowy Mountains Authority so we can check out this infrastructure being built, and which is probably the only time I ever won well, it wasn't an argument, it was suggestion, but we spent a week there, Absolutely mind-boggling what was achieved. In those days, we brought people in from overseas to do it, and we got tonight here a man that played a major role in building that infrastructure. From there, Lance went to work on the construction of the Tasmanian amazing hydroelectric scheme and the dam construction in the Southeast Asia, before a stint as Professor for Engineering in the Monash University in Melbourne before his retirement. Far from being idle in retirement, Professor Endersbee has devoted his time to developing exciting ideas of infrastructure projects for the national development of Australia, not just in water projects, but in rail and high-speed rail projects. These are the ideas that the Professor will present to us tonight, but before that, let me hand over to the person who is the driving force in tonight's meeting, Jen Pukallus. Jen is your local CEC candidate for Dawson in the upcoming federal election. She has worked tirelessly to get the CEC message out in your local area and to bring Lance into town, and to share with you the kind of ideas that can solve the water problems that we all feel. Ladies and gentlemen, a very special lady, Jen Pukallus.
Well, thanks Morris, and thanks everybody. You can tell we're on a first name basis. Okay, we've got a special presentation tonight on the solutions to the great crisis of water scarcity. Before I hand over to our guest speaker, Professor Lance Endersbee, I'd like to take a few moments to explain why the CEC has gone to such an effort to bring the Professor up from Melbourne for this meeting. Australia is facing a national water crisis, not because we're in drought. As you may have heard me say before, the drought's between the politicians' ears. We're facing a national water crisis because for the past few decades, the necessary investment in infrastructure to anticipate our future water needs has been blocked for political reasons. The investment has been blocked by the small-mindedness of economic rationalism and the completely irrational fear-mongering of environmentalists. First, under the policy of economic rationalism, or globalisation, which was first imposed under Hawke and Keating and continued under John Howard. Both our future and our past have been repeatedly robbed for the short-term goal of balancing the current year's budget. We've robbed from the past by privatising, in the last 15 years, almost $100 billion worth of assets, like Qantas, like Telstra, the Commonwealth Bank, and various state electricity systems, which took many decades to work and investment to build up. In that same period of time, we've robbed from the future by spending over $120 billion less on infrastructure than we should have, which we call the infrastructure deficit. In other words, we're paying the consequences of having unbalanced minds trying to balance the budget. And those consequences are much bigger than our water crisis. The policies of globalisation and economic rationalism have been such a disaster all around the world that the world today stands at the brink of economic depression and a clash of civilizations' war. This crisis in the global economy was first forecast by US physical economist and Democratic Party presidential candidate Lyndon LaRouche. He forecast this in the 1990s when he warned that deregulation was looting the physical economy of farming, manufacturing and industry and infrastructure by sucking investment into purely speculative financial activities like currency speculation, property speculation and derivatives. LaRouche illustrated this problem with his famous triple curve graph. The curve below the horizontal line represents the percentage collapse of investment in the physical economy. So that's everything we need to feed and clothe us and keep us warm. While the two curves above the line represent the accelerating increase in the volume of money printed and the accelerating growth of speculative paper like derivatives. Global GDP is around 40 trillion, yet global derivatives turnover has skyrocketed from 400 trillion in 1997 to over 8 quadrillion, or $8,000 trillion, according to the latest release of the Bank of International Settlements. An example of how derivative speculation swamps the physical economy is evident in the current high oil prices. So between being pumped out of the ground and consumed at the petrol bowser, every barrel of oil is kept out at sea for 30 days and traded at an astounding 570 times on the derivatives market. This derivative speculation is an economic bubble, pure and simple. Another bubble in the economy is the property market, where banks, whilst they've been uncompromising to farmers and manufacturers, have willingly loaned literally hundreds of billions of dollars to fuel the property bubble. Since John Howard came to power in March 1996, Australia's net foreign debt has ballooned from 190 billion to 373 billion today, most of which has been incurred by the private banks borrowing at low interest rates overseas to re-lend into the property bubble here. Very soon, with interest rates set to rise, these bubbles will explode and the result will be an economic depression. In terms of physical economy, Australia is already in depression. Whilst Howard and Costello repeatedly lie that the Australian economy is the best in the world, let's see the true indicators. Let's see what they say. First, the national debt. Not only the 373 billion foreign debt, but also the suffocating level of household debt, which has jumped from 68% of household income in 1996 to 140% of household income today, which is the highest level in the world. We have a record trade deficit, and currently Australia is going through its worst export slump since the 1930s depression. On top of that, our current account deficit, which is our trade deficit plus our foreign interest payments, is well over 40 billion per year. It broke through the 6% banana republic level years ago. Another key indicator to the true state of our physical economy is unemployment. You may have heard the government boast that the official unemployment rate is 5%, its lowest since 1980, but that too is a lie. Professor Bill Mitchell of the University of Newcastle has documented the real unemployment rate in Australia at close to 20% when you factor in the massive number of people who can and want to work but who've given up looking and therefore simply are not counted in the statistics. Consider also this basic question. If the Australian economy is so strong, as the major parties tell us, why is it that the government cannot afford to provide adequate public health care, quality public education and decent level of services? Denial is a symptom of psychosis, and the major parties are definitely in denial. You can draw your own conclusions. The CEC, on the other hand, has based its election campaign on addressing this crisis at a global level and at a local level. At a global level, LaRouche proposed back in 1997, during the Asia crisis, the establishment of a new Bretton Woods international monetary system, whereby the present system of globalisation and free trade will be dumped and the IMF system would be placed into an orderly bankruptcy reorganisation. A new Bretton Woods would involve a return to financial regulation in the form of controls on capital flows in and out of Australia, controls of currency exchange rate to stop speculators manipulating the value of our dollar, the strategic use of tariffs to foster the development of important industries, and national banking, whereby national government-owned banks could direct long-term low-interest loans into infrastructure and physical goods production, which would reindustrialise and revitalise economies and create jobs. The CEC has adopted national banking as our number one policy to rebuild the country with the People's Bank, like the old Commonwealth Bank did. Next, show with the Australian ad. We took out this full-page ad in the Australian on September 26, 2002, which over 600 prominent leaders endorsed. We have ready-to-go legislation, the Commonwealth National Credit Bank Bill, which we could pass tomorrow. You can see this legislation in our book, What Australia Must Do to Survive the Depression. Finally, in terms of a solution to the global economic crisis, LaRouche's New Bretton Woods proposal includes the development of grand infrastructure projects which will be the locomotive for world economic development. The next one. LaRouche is the author of this project, the Eurasian Land Bridge, which can be best described as an infrastructure corridor connecting high technology centres of Europe in the west, across Eurasia in a number of routes, all the way to the massive population centres of China and Southeast Asia, even including down as far as Jakarta. This project represents a different vision from the future of the world than what we are currently witnessing from George Bush, John Howard and Tony Blair. While they push their clash of civilizations and seek to dominate the world using the threat of preemptive nuclear strikes, this project offers a basis for collaboration between nations, which can achieve peace through economic development. The CEC is championing a number of similar great projects for our nation, most of which are the brainchild of Professor Endersbee. So I'll let him take you through those details. Before that, I would like to address the second factor that blocks investment in infrastructure, just as damaging as economic rationalism, which is the Irrational Environmentalist movement. A powerful lobby group has formed in recent times which is dedicated to stopping any plans of building dams or construct water diversion projects to drought-proof Australia. That lobby calls itself the Wentworth Group. Its key spokesmen are Dr. Tim Flannery and Professor Peter Cullen. The Wentworth Group is a front for the Worldwide Fund for Nature, and its opposition to water projects is a cover for its real agenda, which is population reduction. The WWF is the mother of environmental movements worldwide, and population reduction is its obsession. Its founder, Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, said in 1988, in the event I am reincarnated, I would like to return as a deadly virus to contribute something to solve overpopulation. The Wentworth Group's Dr. Tim Flannery is famous in his 1994 claim that Australia is overpopulated and should only have a population of 6 to 7 million people. These groups have resurrected a form of pagan Mother Earth worship wherein any human activity in the environment is seen as a violation against Mother Earth. They have paraded it as science using terms like sustainability and biodiversity. This is used as a justification to block any improvements in the landscape that would benefit the industries that feed, clothe and shelter people. For example, the WWF set up the Wentworth Group to oppose any drought-proofing water diversion projects on the basis that Australia is historically a dry continent. According to them, if you can't produce food without interfering with the environment, don't produce food. This is not science, it's anti-science. Compare their kookery to the ideas of a truly great scientist, the great Russian biogeochemist Vladimir Vernadsky. Vernadsky was the protege of the great Dmitry Mendeleev, who you might remember from high school chemistry as the man who gave the world the periodic table of the elements. Vernadsky combined the field of biology, geology and chemistry into one discipline, biogeochemistry. He was the author of the term biosphere, the envelope of life around the Earth, around the surface of the Earth, and was the world's first environmental scientist. Vernadsky maintained that human ideas and activity were as much a part of nature as that of any other species on the planet. The essential, unique human activity is cognition, and therefore the products of human cognition, scientific and technological advancements, are part of and complement nature. He used the term noosphere to describe how human ideas transformed the physical biosphere into a sphere where the dominant force was ideas. This is not to say that human beings can't be destructive, but it does destroy the greedy assumption that anything human is always destructive. What is truly destructive is the warped philosophy of the Wentworth Group, which has the ear of our governments and is stopping any plans to truly address the water crisis. An example of its influence is a statement by Victorian Premier Steve Bracks in Melbourne, in the Melbourne Herald Sun on Thursday, on Melbourne's water shortages. He said, "A new dam is not the answer. It doesn't create new water. It takes it from rivers like the Yarra and from farmers. It's like opening a new bank account to create money." So this is the insanity we're up against. We in the CEC are using this election campaign to take up the political fight against this insanity and for sound ideas to address the economic, social and infrastructure problems. I urge you to get behind this fight for the exciting ideas that we are fighting for. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to just remind you that we'd like you to join into the fight. Give us a bit of a hand. Back this young lady. She's put her hat in the ring. It's a big thing for a young woman and her husband to actually do what they're doing. They've got 4 beautiful children and they've got to be raised. And my generation's basically out playing bowls or something. They should be doing this. And most of you probably think, what can little me do? And we've run into this because we've been around a long time and the establishment's put everything against us, from CAPs to Hansonism and everything, and splinter the splinter grapes. We're still here. And always remember an old analogy I like. It took amateurs to build the Ark and a bunch of professionals built the Titanic. So don't ever get down to that little what can little me do. That's the old colonial think small, think little business. But many years ago, we've heard LaRouche mentioned here tonight, and I was one of the culprits that met this man many years ago in the US, and his ideas inspired me because they were the same sort of thing that we're on about, against free trade, which is now globalisation, currencies, controls. But he had these water projects. The Wampa project was to bring the water down on the eastern side of the Rockies from Canada. He had another one in the Oasis plan to greening the deserts in the Middle East, and another one in Mexico, the Juarez program. And then we got together and realised we had a man in this country many years ago, was a great thinker, a man called Bradfield. And he wanted to bring the water from north down in and flood all Central Australia. And if it had have happened, he said then, in 1940, whatever it was, that there'd be probably 60-odd million people in our nation today. And that's what we're lacking as people. We've got the population of New York on the landmass of Australia. So that's really what we're about. And lo and behold, out of the blue came, I suppose you could coin a phrase, a giant of a man. But no, Lance had been sitting in his retirement, building projects to suit our nation, which is comparable to what we're about and far greater ideas. And I think it's an incredible privilege to have this man in your city here tonight. So bear with us, and I'll give you now Professor Lance Endersbee.
Good. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great privilege to be here with you and to support Jan in what she's trying to do. And thank you, Jan, for inviting me up here. What I want to talk to you about tonight is really terribly serious, and it's not the sort of thing we're able to discuss very easily in Australia. Jan has mentioned this business of the possibility of a very serious financial depression in the world. And I think there are strong possibilities of that. The reason for it is that governments, and in particular the US government, has got itself into a position where it is effectively printing money. And it is supporting the world by supporting countries like China and Japan and others that make goods and, if you like, export them from China into America. The Americans are great consumers and they're paying for them with printed money. and they're also helping to support their needs for the war with printed money. And this is a very dangerous state of affairs. And every now and again, things like that start to go wrong. And when things go wrong in the financial markets and the banks start to get worried, you can visualise that a little bit in the financial market in Australia. If you look at the prices of houses in Sydney and Melbourne, and there are whole suburbs with houses worth more than $1 million. And of course, most of them are under mortgage, just to the bank, and so the bank's assets are mortgages. And a property market with, say, whole suburbs with houses over $1 million, there could be a recession in the property market, and those prices of houses of, say, $1 million might drop to 800,000. Now you may think that's just a little bit, but that's taking 20% off the, if you like, the capital holdings of the banks. So the banks get worried about things like that. And when that happens, they don't start, if you like, restricting loans to homeowners in the suburbs. They pick the soft targets. And very often they're farmers or miners and manufacturers. About 4 or 5 years ago, my wife and I went down to Sale, and I was invited there to by the National Civic Council, which is a Roman Catholic group. And they invited us there to a meeting of farmers, just as large as this meeting here tonight. And before the meeting, the chairman had Meg and I to dinner, and we're just sitting there quietly. And he said, "Well, Lance, I might as well tell you why you're here." I said, "Oh, golly, what's this going to be?" And then he said, "In the last 6 months, there have been 19 suicides of dairy farmers in this district. It hasn't been mentioned in the press, and they're trying to keep it quiet. And also, as a Roman Catholic group, they were very disturbed by these suicides. And he told me that he wanted me to talk to the people on an optimistic and positive view of the possible future for those farmers in Gippsland." Now today, you face the dreadful prospect of similar things in other industries in Australia, and one of them is the sugar industry. And we have to work our way through the problems of the sugar industry. I think it is a national calamity, but it doesn't necessarily mean we solve the problems by subsidies or direct subsidies, because it could be that all we're doing is propping up or trying to stop a failure which may be inevitable. And that's what I want to talk to you about tonight. We have to think of new ways of doing things. We have to provide options and go about it in a fairly solid, logical way and get on with the job. And may I also just comment on something that Jan said about populations and things like that. One of the reasons for the great increase in populations of the world is that people are living longer. And there's no way I want to control populations at my end of the age group. So let me talk to you about what we see here. I'm starting off by showing you an aspect of Australia that we don't normally look at. You can see the outline of Australia there, Tasmania here, but offshore we have this great gulf down there. And this map is a map that has been coloured according to elevation. The low-lying fields around the Gulf of Carpentaria are all light green, and Lake Eyre and the Murray-Darling Basin is light green. There are the mountains there. There's Mount Kosciuszko. There's the mountains just off from Makai. That's Makai. There, you see it there? Makai. There's the Great Barrier Reef. Okay. Now, offshore, down the coast of New South Wales and down to Victoria, see that deep blue? that is really just a sharp cliff that goes down to a depth of 5,000 metres. And that is deeper below sea level than the height of Mount Kosciuszko above the ground. So Mount Kosciuszko is about 3,000 metres. That there is 5,000 metres below sea level. Up there, you see the little string. They are undersea, old, ancient volcanoes under the sea. And you remember when that British Navy ship ran aground and they carted it, they had to take it all the way back to England on a great big floating dock. Well, it hit one of those. And you see another ring of volcanoes there. Now, all of this is the sort of information we now have about our world. And we're able to plan and reason and do a lot of things that many years ago were not possible to us. You'll appreciate this sort of thing aids the fishermen and others, and of course all those nations that are competing with us in fishing these waters out here off our international border are aware of all of this, and they're taking advantage of that information next time. And so I want to talk to you about our prospects. And the first thing is that just offshore from Australia, we have 3 billion people. There's an enormity of trade going on there. At any one time, half of the world's container ships are in that sea there. Half of the world's container ships. So this is an area of great trade. And there they are, a huge growing market for Australia. China, 1,200 million, India, 1,000 million, Japan, 125, and so on. A great potential market for Australia and a great influence. At the same time, you have to recognise that 3 billion people is an awful lot. We're 20 million. And so you've got to think of, that's 3,000 million over 20. Well, 3,000 over 20 is about 150 times, isn't it? So there's 150 of them for every one of us. And we have to think in those terms. And not only is there 150 of them for every one of us, they're not peasants anymore. Out of that 3,000 million people, there's tens of millions of people that are very much wealthier than people in Australia. So, you know, we've got to think of it that this is a different system. Next slide. Now, the last time I was in Makai, believe it or not, was in 1945. Immediately after the war, I was sent up here to have a look at the rehabilitation of the Makai airport. Because, you know, the Americans and others had been working on it, and I was sort of charged with the business of trying to work out how we were going to rebuild the pavements and so on for civil aircraft. But it was an entirely different place in 1945. I can remember I stayed in a hotel where there was a courtyard with cobblestones where the coaches used, horses and coaches used to be. So I stayed in a very old pub. But today there are serious problems. But you've got this great city which from 1945 to now it's appeared that vast areas which have been built upon, which weren't there when I was here. But there are still problems, I notice. There are closed shops and things around the streets. But there's great potential, and I want to talk to you about that. Next one. And so, this is what we can do these days. This is a satellite view. Can you recognise some of the islands offshore? You can see the river there? What river is that? What reservoir is that? What reservoir is that? Good on you. You're doing well. Okay. Well, there you are. You see, we can, next slide, we can look at what the place is like. But now that's what's happened to it. You see, if that satellite picture was taken today, they'd be very much smaller, wouldn't they? Next one. And Jan took these for me just earlier this month, just to show me the problems of water supply. Next one. There you are, there's a Kinchan Dam. It's just a mud flat. Next one. Okay, and the next. There you are. So, okay, what are we going to do about it? Next one. In the past, it's been a practice to build dams where there were sites for reservoirs and large storage areas. And now we see that that combination may not be available anymore. The mountains are steep and rocky and the water just gushes over the surface and flows down these steep mountain sides. So I think it might be necessary to look at the possibility of building diversion dams in the steep country and trying to divert the water over to storages elsewhere. And I'll show you that, and I feel as if the cost may not be higher, the distances are rather short. And the next one, Dennis. And here's one of the thoughts. And this is just thinking off the top of my head, just looking at maps. I must admit I've never visited the site, and if there are any engineers in the audience, they'd sack me immediately for coming up with ideas like this without actually setting foot on the site. But just looking at the maps, and these days you've got data which you can get this sort of thing just download on the internet and you're off and running, so it's rather wonderful. But there's Timber Dam there, but immediately downstream there's this gorge running down there, and there's quite a fall down there, so it'd be possible to build some sort of a dam and diversion dam there. Wouldn't have a great storage, but if you could just sort of manage to cut through there, you could just run it by gravity down into Kinchan Dam, which would then enable you to, so you could have that catchment feeding into Kinchan Dam, and the same thing is possible down here. And so in an event of a storm, you fill this one up and it overflows, and you put some more water in this one, and you try and get all the water down to Kinchan. Now that's the sort of thing you've got to think about, and I believe that it is possible. But as it is, it's purely and simply a theoretical exercise I did because I was invited up to Makai. So, okay, this is just for local consumption. Plan for prosperity. Don't believe that everything's gone wrong. Anticipate needs for new infrastructure, water supply, wastewater treatment, electricity and so on, and investment and get on with it. Now, the reason why I'm saying that is that I'm going to be talking about the possibility for other industries and new starts around here. And industry can't invest unless they believe that the councils, the national, state and local levels of government, they're partners in the prosperity. They're planning for the future. And if they're confident, the private sector can then also invest with confidence. When governments lose faith, the private sector loses faith as well. So we've got to be positive in thinking about what we're doing. Now, the fact of having a positive plan does not necessarily mean that you're committed to unnecessary expenditure. What you're doing, you're saying, we intend to get there and this is our plans for the future. And you then, if you like, adjust your progress to the opportunities that are arising in the community and the sort of needs of the community. So you have plans for the future, but you judge your rate of progress to be prudent. Next slide. Okay. Sugar. And as I said, sugar is a diabolical problem in Australia. And here's sugar cane 3 metres tall. Fertile grounds up there, there's the Cairns in the volcanic country and so on. And look at the height of the cane. And so, okay, this is an enormous possibility, but next slide. But the facts are, in world sugar production from 84 right through to 2003, that's what's happened. World sugar production has increased enormously. North America, in the EU and the Caribbean, and it would include Australia, we're there. So in other words, production in the, if you like, the developed economies is relatively static. The great growth is in South America, Asia and Africa. Look at the great growth. So all of world growth, all the growth in world production of sugar is in low-cost countries. That's point one. All of the growth in sugar is in low-cost countries. Next slide. When we look at the export markets, the sugar export market, these low-cost countries dominate the export market. So in that time, the low-cost countries were exporting that much. Now they're exporting that much. So that means Australia, in the sugar export market, has to compete with South America, Asia and Africa, and in particular Brazil. So the low-cost countries dominate the export markets. Next slide. And of course, the prices are falling. The refined price and the raw price of sugar is falling. So we've got the low-cost countries like Brazil dominating the export market, shoving sugar into the market, and the prices are falling. And our farmers, sugar farmers, the cane growers in Australia, are suffering. And it's quite understandable. Next slide. But I say we make progress by facing reality. And one of the things I worry about in the sugar statements and the proposals by the Australian government and Premier Beattie and so on, they're going to fight and prop up the industry. I think that's suicide. We make progress by facing the reality that we've got competitors who are going to fight us to the death, and the Brazilians have got a much greater propensity and ability to tighten their belt than we have. So it's a fight to the death in the export market, and I'm saying let's get out of it. I'll tell you about that in a minute. Sugar is a tyranny of distance crop. Now, it's important to understand this. Most of Australian agriculture developed on the basis of being able to supply goods to overseas markets that didn't require, if you like, expensive forms of storage. We started off almost 200 years ago, if you like, buying wool. Now, the great advantage of wool is that you could cut, is that the sheep could just walk around the countryside. The shearers came in, you cut the wool. Okay, it might take a while to take a bale of wool down to the ports and eventually got onto a ship and eventually got to England and it ended up in Manchester or somewhere or in Europe and we sold the wool there. The time to market didn't matter. It was a tyranny of distance crop. Because we were far away from the markets, we grew crops that would be safe and be able to make money, if you like, years after the event. Canned fruit is a good example, dried fruit is another, wheat is another example. So and sugar is a tyranny of distance crop. The Australian export sugar has to compete in world markets with the lowest cost sugar producers in the world. So whether we like it or not, we've got to compete with the poorest countries and the lowest cost labour, and even worse, and where the governments are subsidising it. So not only do they have low-cost labour, the governments are trying to support it further. The future for Australian cane growers lies in new activities, and I want to show you what they may do. And governments have a clear responsibility to help these changes. And they're going to be fairly dramatic, but there's no alternative. If we're going to solve, I mentioned the dairy farmers down there in Gippsland, if we're going to solve the problems for these cane farmers, we've got to get them into new activities within a year or two. That's just, and to help them to do it. Next slide. So here's my proposal. Get out of the sugar export market as soon as possible. It's a financial death trap. The last thing the Australian government and the Beattie government want to do is to encourage the sugar, the cane growers and the mills to produce sugar for export. It's a financial death trap. When every sugar exporting nation is subsidising exports and Brazil is setting lower and lower prices to knock out the opposition, it's stupid to try and stay in the game. You get out quickly and save your life. We face a national emergency in sugar. And there are better and more profitable ways of using our land and resources, and I want to talk to you about that. In other words, we're not going to get out of sugar when we're going to lose money. We get out of sugar so we can make more money. Let's look at it. And the federal government assistance package is an attempt to appease critics and to assist the industry to stay in the market. It's misdirected. Next slide.
Excuse me, my friend.
Yes? Oh, right, sorry. We've got customers just arriving. Now, I use this here to demonstrate this matter of tyranny of distance and the challenge of time. You can appreciate that if we're in sugar, grains, grazing, canned and dried fruit, the distance to market doesn't matter and the time to market doesn't matter. And so, but the profits are low because you're competing with the lowest cost producers in the world. On the other hand, when you go to intensive horticulture, fresh fruit and vegetables, shelf-life food, live animals, if it can get your goods to the market in market time, that's where you make the profits. So you make profits, and say in the sugar industry, we're going to have to move from sugar to intensive horticulture. And it's fertile land, so it's something we can do. And I want to show you, not with and living in Victoria, I'm not saying this is something we're doing down there, it's absolutely wonderful. I'm just showing you this as a theoretical concept to use as a model for the cane farmers locally. Next slide. Now, Queensland tropical and subtropical climate makes it Australia's main producing variety of cereal crops, citrus, tropical and exotic fruits. You can have two crops. You can have summer growing crops and winter crops, and its potential to develop new export markets. Let's look at Victoria. Next one. Horticultural exports in Victoria. Are you ready? Here they were, $250 million in 1994-5, and they're up to 450, heading to 500 million. So they've almost doubled in those years. And it's fresh fruit. Fresh fruit. Fresh vegetables. Processed vegetables. Processed fruit, other, and nuts. And you see the growth over 9 years. So it's a growing export market. And let's have a look at the next one. And here's the vegetables. Vegetable exports from Victoria. Asparagus. See that wonderful growth in asparagus? Who would have thought asparagus? Now this is happening just near where we live down in Frankston, south of Melbourne. It's in Kuirap. And asparagus, they cut the asparagus overnight because of the nature of quick growing asparagus. You've got to, it's something that grows very quickly, you cut it and get it to market. And so they're cutting the asparagus every night at about 2 or 3 a.m. in the morning. They have it on the plane at Tullamarine at 9 a.m. So it's, the farmer cuts the asparagus at 3 a.m. It's packaged and at the airport on a plane to Japan at 9 a.m. Later that same day, it's arriving in Japan, and the following day, if you like, just a little bit over 24 hours and being cut, it is on sale in Japanese supermarkets. Great, wonderful, and you see they're making a profit, doing very nicely with asparagus. And they can, and because it's fresh and grown in a biologically okay place like Australia, it fetches a good price in the Japanese markets, and the price they get well covers the $3 odd per kilogram of air freight. And so it's a profitable thing. The same thing with vegetable juice. Brassicas, look at that. Who would have got frozen vegetables? And so the vegetable exports are just going up like that. And so this is something we might be able to do here. Next slide. And here's a special rural industries. Live horses, believe it or not. But that's not bad. They're getting about $30 million a year from live horses. If they export live horses from Melbourne, you can export live pigs. To Eurasian markets from Makai, they like pork. And here's the other things. Goat meat, honey and beeswax, native flowers. Near us, down also just on the edge of Western Port, Gerbras, you know the beautiful gerbera flowers? They're cutting them, sending them by air freight to Japan. And of course they're so glorious flowers and they're wonderful, brilliant colours. They sell very well in Japan and they're very light. So the air freight is not that much. And so there's special exports. Next slide. Now there's the destinations. Japan, Hong Kong, New Zealand, Malaysia, USA, Singapore, you know, Taiwan, Indonesia, and so we've got air exports. Next slide. So here's my proposal. Examine prospects for entirely new activities in local agriculture, all directed to new export markets. Governments to get on immediately with encouraging the conduct of plant trials. You see, you might have a potential export market in custard apples, for example. And you've got to think about it and get on it. We need trials for needed processing plants and market surveys. Governments to provide farmers with the information they need so the farmers can get on with it. Now, we're going to be dependent on the farmers themselves being entrepreneurial and being inspired and getting on with the job. They're going to need all the support they can get from the government. But at the same time, we're going to be dependent on the initiative of the farmers themselves in taking advantage of potential new opportunities. Next slide. Now here's Avalon Airport in Victoria. Possibly many of you have never heard of Avalon Airport. Well, it's just over there, south of Melbourne, near Geelong. This is Lindsay Fox. You know Lindsay Fox? Lynn Fox Transports and all the rest of it. Lindsay Fox owns this airport. He operates 2 airports in Melbourne, Essendon and Avalon and Essendon. And you can see he's got 160 tenants and all that. Avalon and Essendon provide logistics access for domestic and international air and occupy a leading role. And they've got major companies doing that. So we have a new airport south of Melbourne devoted principally to international air freight. Proposal 4, upgrade Makai Airport to serve international and domestic air freight. It's right there. Rather than making an election promise, get off and give permission straight away. Get Virgin and Qantas to serve by direct cheap flights, and I gather they're happening now. But the important thing is, if these air freighters are leaving Melbourne and flying to Japan and Taiwan and Korea and North China, Mackay is almost on the way. And so it would be quite possible to, if you like, have air freighters from Melbourne with asparagus and what have you, stopping in Mackay to get tropical fish and tropical fruit and vegetables, and on its way to the markets. And of course, if it's a private thing with Lindsay Fox and all this, you have the advantage of the whole freight system behind you. Next slide. So, proposal again. Farmers and fishermen to recognise the potential market in Asia for Australian supply of supermarket type fruits, vegetables, fish and processed food. And I want the farmers and the fishermen to study the market. I'd like the Australian government to support the farmers and fishermen and send them up to Japan and get them to look at the supermarkets, and into China and get them to look at the supermarkets and work out what things they can do to supply those markets, and for the government to sort of organise things so that Mackay becomes an air freight export airport. So now, if they arrange communication by internet, and this is the sort of thing we do these days, it means that the local farmers and fishermen can photograph their produce with a digital camera, put it on the internet instantly, and the customer in Japan can look at what he's buying and bid for it. So you can have eBay.com every day. Have any of you bid for anything on the internet? It's fun. But it is possible. And so we're going to need communication by internet. We need the farmers to see the markets, to get to know the people, and then develop the communications so they're able to send their goods directly to their customer. The more export business we do, the more frequent the air services. Now, I think all governments, national and state, should plan for a major increase in Australian agricultural output directed to Asian markets, particularly supermarket type activities. Strategically, it is prudent for governments to do so, because if our potential is so great, and I'm going to show you a bit more of that, it's going to be very easy for wealthy Chinese and others just to come in and take charge of it for us. I'm going to want to explain that to you. And the Australian government should take the lead in preparing an integrated plan of national development projects directed to these export markets. In other words, if we're going to go down this track, we need to build our roads and our rail and our airports to suit a new, prosperous Australia. Next slide. So, I've been talking about the export markets. There's a domestic market which is totally ignored in this area. There are 15 million people south of the Queensland-New South Wales border, and there's hardly any contact. If you try to send stuff out of this part of Queensland, it's got to go down through Brisbane and try and work its way to Sydney and Melbourne down the coast route, because that's what the Queensland government likes. Virtually all of the major roads and system in Queensland is directed to roads or rail to the coast and transport down the coast. But there's the market down there, and we want to get the stuff from there to there within a day. And we're not going to do it by that route. And traditionally in Australia, because of the Constitution, all states see themselves as sovereign states. The Constitution was written over 100 years ago to preserve the idea of state economies, totally independent, competing on the world markets, state ports and state rail. The states liked the fact that the rail systems were of different gauges, because in Queensland that meant that New South Wales couldn't come in, and in Victoria that meant that New South Wales couldn't come in. So they had separate rail gauges, and they thought that was a good thing. And you've got to remember that road transport had not been invented when the Australian Constitution was written. So all of a sudden, we've got road transport, and we've got separate and independent states that don't want to trade with one another. And so there's always been a blockage on the interstate highways, and we're still arguing about the Pacific Highway. You know, just the other day, Anderson's talking, we're going to throw hundreds of millions of dollars at the Pacific Highway. It's an absolute scandal that they have to wait for so long. But it's been a policy of the state governments not to, if you like, agree or facilitate trade between the states. They are totally self-centred in that. They don't want to trade between the states. They certainly don't want to share water. And so I'm saying the new road works for national needs must be a federal responsibility. The states just can't be trusted to build, and they won't. Next slide. And so I was in Perth and up in the Ord, and I saw these road trains. Now, can you go back to the previous slide, Dennis? Or? There's the Ord up there, and those road trains go from there across to Broome and then down to Perth, and they do a weekly round trip from the Ord to Perth, selling Ord fresh fruit and vegetables into Perth. The distance from, say, Makai to Sydney, you should be able to do 2 or 3 trips a week. And the same thing down, you should be able to do certainly 3 trips in 2 weeks, that way. So the distances are much shorter. We should look at road trains like that. The Makai to Sydney is much shorter, and there'd be an enormous amount of produce we could sell in southern supermarkets from here. And the important thing to note, the potential is up here, but the access to markets is denied. And if the federal government facilitates the access to the markets, people then grow their crops for the market. The farmers grow for a market, and at the present moment, access to the market is denied. And so we have a mad situation here in Australia they've got 15 million people south of the New South Wales-Queensland border, and there's virtually no real access south of the border for fresh fruit and vegetables and fish and things like that. So we've got to change that. Next slide. And so one of the other things I'm proposing is roads like that and roads like that. And you can see that's virtually a direct route south. And that could be a good route south. Now, my wife and I travelled down part of this route the other day, and it's this road through here, and where am I going? Here's Burke down to Cobar and down to Niliquin and so on. We had a glorious run through. It was clear and straight as it can be. And that's the route we've got to get onto. But we've got to make these other connections up here to make it possible. And some more connections down there. Next slide. So, next proposal. Build new and improved roads to connect the farms to the major domestic markets. It's absolutely mad from a national point of view that the local people here can't access those markets. Not a token thing. It's road to be a sufficient width within a wide lane. Road trains. Now, a mate of mine in Melbourne is involved in the design of these Kenworth trucks and the road trains. These are absolutely fantastic these days, computer controlled. And with a road train like I showed you, there is computer control of the trailers so that the trailers follow the same tracks as the front wheels. So you know, if you drive, any of you that have been driving your own trailer, you know when you go around the corner, the trailer behind your car tends to make a shortcut. Well, if you're driving a road train like that, you don't want the third trailer to be making a shortcut. And this mate of mine, he's been working on the computer control of these road trains so that the following trailers follow exactly the same track as the front wheels, steering wheels. The first wheels of the first trailer. And so the whole thing is designed so the whole vehicle tracks. Some of these 3 and 4 trailer road trains in the mining industry, they go around quite narrow roads. And it's absolutely uncanny. The trailers are just sitting straight, squarely in the middle of the road all the way on these, in these mining things. We can do the same on main roads. So these road trains need not be a hazard in the, in the normal roads in Australia. They can stay directly and squarely in their own track. The important thing is to make sure the roads are wide enough so that you allow passing lanes and regular passing lanes for other traffic. But the road trains can travel at 100 kilometres an hour, dead straight, and just follow the road absolutely accurately. Next slide. So, let's now talk about the market. Exporting to a new world of huge cities. Next. Now, the world population this year is increasing by 78 million people. Get that? The world population this year, I made sure, in fact, in thinking, somewhere I've got the exact figure because I checked it out for the world population as it's expected to be at the end of this month. 78 million odd and what have you. That means that the world population is growing at the rate of 1 Australia every 3 months. Can you comprehend what that means? Growth of 1, it's an awful lot of mouths to feed, it's an awful lot of coal, it's an awful lot of minerals, you name it. 1 Australia every 3 months. In Asia, it's 1 Australia every 6 months. Next slide, Dennis. Now, at the same time as the population is growing, in much of the world, the wealth is increasing. And as well as the population increasing, we're finding that there is corresponding industrial development. Now, I want you to think about all of the electricity generation in Australia. Let's think of all of the electricity generation in Sydney and Melbourne and Brisbane and so on, right up through Queensland. I want you to think of all the thermal power stations and Wivenhoe and the Snowy Scheme and hydro in Tasmania and what have you in Western Australia. I want you to think about all the lights in the streets around here and through all the lights in the streets in Sydney and Melbourne, all of the factories chugging away, all using electricity and so on, all of the people with their ovens and refrigerators. And I want you to think of the entire electricity consumption in Australia each year. You get the idea of that? The entire electricity consumption in Australia each year. It just so happens that's my phone. I'm not available there. You think of the entire electricity consumption in Australia this year. Now the world is growing at that rate every 7.7 months. Can you get the idea? You can imagine that all this generation in Australia, all of the electricity consumption, the total of Australia is a huge amount, and the world is increasing by that every, as I say, every 7.7 months. Now, that is also consistent with the fact that the population of the world is increasing by 78 million this year. So the population of the world is increasing by 78 million, and around the world they're improving their electricity supply and they're building their cities and they're putting up all the distribution systems and everything else, and that's growing at one Australia every 7.7 months. Now, that is also a great potential demand for Australia. Around here, you've seen all the coal export growing, where it's moving, that's where it's going. Next slide, Dennis. And we've got to remember the fact that our neighbours, here we are, Malaysia, Singapore, they're also growing. So whilst Australia's growing, they are growing much more rapidly. And so we have to anticipate that our neighbours in Malaysia, Singapore and Indonesia are becoming more and more developed. And they're having more and more industries and large cities. Next one. So, Shanghai. Well, I was recently in Shanghai with one of my sons. He, very nice, you know, he said, Dad, is your passport in order? And I said, yeah. He said, can I have it? And I said, okay. I said, what's on? He said, I'm taking you to Shanghai for Father's Day. I thought that was very nice, and then I realised that if he'd taken one of his staff, he would have had to pay their fare and pay them to sort of carry his bag for a couple of weeks. It was cheaper and easier to get Dad to do it. And I didn't mind helping out because it enabled me to see this sort of thing. And here's this wonderful growth in Shanghai. I've never seen more dramatic civil engineering in my life. Enormously impressive. Next slide, Dennis. And their cities. Here's the Shanghai City Hall. And here's the, you know, the Peace Hotel there. And we're looking across into this new development here in Pudong, in Shanghai. There's a development on the other side of the river. And some of the world's tallest buildings are being built over here. Quite remarkable. Next slide. And we saw this wonderful Maglev Train. Do you know about the Maglev Train? The Chinese, consulted with this German firm that had invented the idea of train with magnetic levitation, where if you like, you know the way magnets can repel. And so the train was supported above the track by magnetic repulsion. And so this train, see that track there? It doesn't touch the track, it floats above it. It travels at 400 kilometres per hour. And you can travel from Shanghai to the airport in about 5 minutes or something like that for a 40-kilometre trip. Rather wonderful. And it is being extended from Shanghai right through to Beijing, and they're hoping to have it, Shanghai to Beijing, which is about 800,000 kilometres, they hope to have it operating for the Olympic Games so that people can, when they just fly to China, they'll all want to travel on the train. This is wonderful. But the important thing about that is that the Chinese also built the train, as well as all the track, with the German design. And they've arranged with the Germans that, in effect, they have the world market now, world rights, to manufacturing those trains. So anybody who wants a magnetic levitation train anywhere in the world, the Chinese are going to make the trains for them. So how's that, you see, how's that for sophistication? And you can see that when you walk around the big cities in China, you see everybody walking, like here, everybody with a mobile phone. But the fact is, they didn't have to go through all the problem of landlines or anything. They just leapt into mobile phones without having any wires in the streets. It's rather wonderful. So here's Shanghai and this wonderful airport. Oh, I just mentioned this wonderful airport building there. It's really quite incredible. Yeah, it's a huge open enclosed space. You know, way other airports, you know, they're fairly large and what have you, and you've got various terminals and things. And this one, they all seem to be together. And you get into that place, and you can see for miles. It's really quite incredible. And the height there, so it's a cable suspended roof, and there's several of them. And it's all, and moving walkways, and you get on the moving walkways and you just look at all the sights. It's terrific. Most impressive. Next slide. So, this then comes to water. About 1/2 of the world population depend on groundwater for all or part of their water supply. The world's wells are drying up due to depletion rates far in excess of natural recovery, and that applies to the artesian basin as well. The surge to the cities is amplified by the rapid decline of groundwater. Next slide. In India, all of that area there, a large part of that area of India is dependent on groundwater, and they're using groundwater for irrigation. But the Indian government, being, if you like, a modern government, they decided to allow market forces to prevail, and some big operators came in and drilled deep bores and grew large crops, and effectively they drove the peasants off the land. The peasants that had been there for years suddenly found that their wells were going dry. Next slide. And that's a typical well in India, and a pump, and the ladies every day get the water, and the waters, and such wells like this all around the world are drying up. There are many parts of India and in Africa where women carry stuff like that on their heads 5-10 kilometres each day, and the children. And the wells, all over the world, the wells are drying up because people are taking water, which is residual waters, and they're not being replenished. One of the sad things is that they all believed it was being replenished from rainfall, and it is not. Next slide. In the North China Plain, up here in China, in 1996, they had 3.6 million wells. They abandoned 99,000 in 1997. They drilled 220,000 new ones, and they're chasing the water down 3 metres a year. So they're pumping the water out, and each year they have to go 3 metres deeper to get more water. And there's 400 million people living on that plain. And as the water tables fall, the springs dry up, the streams cease to flow, and lakes disappear. In one province, they had 1,000 lakes, only 83 remain. And so China faces food scarcity, and they must import food. And the present water use in that North China Plain is 5 times more than our annual irrigation use in the Murray-Darling Basin. So China's in the market, in the world market for food. Opportunities for Australia. China's in the world market for food. Next slide. In the deserts, they used to have wells like this, and they're chasing the water down. And sometimes the wells are just drying up. Next slide. But a lot of the wells drying up are in fact in the Muslim countries. And that is a very interesting state of affairs. My wife and I were recently in Morocco. We were looking at some of the problems there, and I'm well aware of the problems in India and in China. Next slide. So other countries in serious water deficit: Yemen, water table falling 2 metres a year; Iran, Egypt, Mexico, Ghana, Morocco, Pakistan,